Iron Man or Captain America? Who was right? Most people say there's no correct answer, but it seems there actually is. In this video, you'll understand that they weren't really fighting over the Sokovia Accords, but over something much deeper, guilt and trauma from their past. The Accords were just the pretext, a way to channel everything they'd been carrying for a long time. In 1991, a Hydra agent arrives at a secret base in Siberia. He enters a code and finds a red notebook with a star. He orders the scientists to thaw him. Bucky Barnes wakes up after years in cryogenic sleep. They drag him to a chair and restrain him. Bucky knows what's coming. He tries to resist, but he can't. Agent Vasily Karpov begins to recite, longing, rusted, 17. Bucky begins to lose control. His mind fragments. Hydra's programming activates. Daybreak, Furnace, 9, Freight Car. And with that, Bucky Barnes ceases to exist, and in his place emerges the Winter Soldier. With a blank stare, he declares ready to comply. Vasily gives him his mission, sanction and extraction, no witnesses allowed. The soldier rides off on a motorcycle. He chases a car, causes it to crash, and approaches the trunk. He takes a few bright blue bags and hands them over to Vasily. In the present, the Avengers discover that Brock Rumlow, a former Hydra agent, is planning to steal a biological weapon from the Institute for Infectious Diseases in Lagos, Nigeria. Steve Rogers, better known as Captain America, along with Natasha Romanoff and Wanda Maximoff, mobilize to stop him. Everything seems calm until a truck crashes into the Institute's entrance. Armed men storm the building. Among them, Rumlow. The Avengers spring into action. Rumlow and his team manage to escape with the biological weapon. In the chaos, it's unclear who has it. The Avengers split up to track them down. Natasha intercepts one, fights him, and manages to recover the weapon. Meanwhile, Steve finds Rumlow and confronts him. Rumlow taunts him. He says the buyer of the weapon is his old friend, Bucky. Steve freezes. Rumlow smiles. He tells him he saw Bucky break down, cry, that they scrambled his brain again. Suddenly, Rumlow activates a bomb on his vest. He plans to take himself out and take the captain with him, but Wanda reacts quickly. With her powers, she contains the explosion before it detonates. She lifts it, trying to move it away from everyone, but she can't control it. Unintentionally, she hurls the blast into a building, killing several civilians. Wanda is devastated. Meanwhile, Tony Stark is at MIT, presenting his new invention, a technology that allows memories to be projected and relived as if you were there. As an example, he shows the last day he saw his parents. His mother was playing the piano. His father, as always, serious and distant, a mundane memory that ended up being the last. After the accident, he never saw them again. At the end of the talk, Tony announces that he will fund all student research projects. Pepper Potts' name appears on the teleprompter as director of the foundation. Tony freezes. He doesn't mention her. He just closes the presentation and steps off the stage. A woman approaches him and says what he did for the students was admirable. Tony replies, "It helps ease my conscience." For Tony, doing good isn't just about values or principles. It's a way to achieve something useful. Reduce harm, balance the scales, ease the guilt. In his logic, an action has value if it changes something in reality. Principles or intentions don't matter. What matters is the effect it produces. This ethical stance is called consequentialism, the idea that the moral value of an action is measured by its consequences. If it leads to a positive outcome, then it's considered right or moral. That's why it doesn't matter if Tony donates money just to feel a little better. It doesn't matter if he does it just for himself. In the end, he's doing something good. That's what counts. And that way of thinking didn't come from nowhere. It comes from his personal history. If you recall, Tony started out as a weapons manufacturer. Stark Industries sold military technology under the idea of protecting the world. He believed he was on the right side. But one day, he's captured and discovers that his own weapons ended up in the hands of the very terrorist groups he swore to fight. It wasn't his intention, but it still happened, and his weapons ended up destroying thousands of lives. After that, he decided to shut down Stark Industries, because he understood that his good intentions aren't enough. What matters isn't what you meant to do, but what you caused. That's why, for Tony, it's the consequences, not the intentions, that define the morality of an action. And soon, we'll see that this way of thinking will directly clash with Captain America's. Just a quick pause to say that if you're enjoying this video and haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. It would mean a lot and really helps me keep making more videos and content like this. Alright, let's get back to the story. The woman pulls out a photo of her son, Charlie Spencer, and says, "I was so proud of everything he achieved until you murdered him. He died in Sokovia." Tony can't respond. Guilt pierces through him. In case you don't remember, Tony had created an artificial intelligence called Ultron to protect the world, but everything spiraled out of control. Ultron turned against humanity and decided that the only way to achieve peace was by eliminating humans. The Avengers tried to stop him, and the final battle took place in Sokovia. They managed to save the world, yes, but the city was destroyed and hundreds of people died. For Tony, who had already lived through something similar with Stark Industries, this is profoundly devastating. He thought he was doing the right thing, but once again, things got out of hand. He can't stop asking himself whether, instead of helping, he's only making everything worse. News outlets quickly begin covering the tragedy in Lagos. They report the deaths of several civilians, among them citizens of Wakanda. King T'Chaka appears in the media. He accuses the Avengers of acting without restraint, above international law. Reports question what authority they have to intervene in another country. Who permitted them to operate in Nigeria? Why do they act above international law? Steve turns off the TV. He tells Wanda not to blame herself so much. He should have realized Rumlow had a bomb vest too. It was both their fault. And now, people are dead. He looks down, trying to process what happened. But then he tells her, we try to save as many people as we can. Sometimes that doesn't mean everybody. But if we can't live with that, then maybe next time, we save no one. As we can see, Steve holds an ethical view that is radically opposed to Tony's. For him, the right thing is to help when you can, because it's what you're supposed to do. Even if it goes wrong, even if it has consequences, what's right doesn't change just because the outcome wasn't perfect. Even when mistakes are made, choosing not to help is not an option. Because if they stop out of fear of being wrong, many people would suffer. For Steve, that would be true cowardice. Refusing to do good simply to avoid carrying the guilt and burden of failure. Later on, we'll see what this philosophy is called, what it truly means, and why it has everything to do with his personal history fighting the Nazis. Tony arrives at the Avengers compound. He brings a guest, Secretary of State Thaddeus Ross. They've fought for the people. They've risked their lives to protect them. But not everyone sees them as heroes. To many, they're a dangerous force. A group with special abilities, based in the United States, who cross borders and act as they wish. Ross shows them a video of each of their interventions. New York in ruins. Washington destroyed, Sokovia wiped off the map, and now Lagos. The Avengers lower their gaze. They know that even if it wasn't their intention, every time they act, someone ends up paying the price. The secretary declares that they've been operating with unlimited power and no oversight. That's why he's come to present a proposal, the Sokovia Accords, a document endorsed by 117 countries. From now on, the Avengers may only act when authorized by a United Nations panel. Steve turns to look at Tony. Why is he supporting this? And the truth is, every time Tony has tried to help, something ends up going wrong. With Stark Industries, he thought he was protecting the world, and he ended up arming terrorists. With Ultron, he wanted to create a global defense and caused a catastrophe. And now, in Lagos, the Avengers he himself assembled caused civilian casualties. Signing the Accords seems like a way to prevent mistakes, letting someone else assess the risks. But if we look more closely, it doesn't seem like Tony only wants to avoid harm. He also wants to stop carrying the guilt. If someone else makes the decisions, then he no longer has to feel responsible when things go wrong. Steve notices this immediately, and to him, it feels like the easy way out. Ross tells them that in 3 days, the UN will meet to ratify the Accords. Natasha asks what would happen if they choose not to sign. Then you retire. If they're not going to operate within the rules, they can no longer continue. Meanwhile, in Cleveland, Vasily Karpov lives in hiding. He hears a knock at the door. A man knocks him down and leaves him unconscious. When he wakes up, he's hanging upside down, tied by his feet over a sink that's beginning to fill with water. In front of him stands Helmut Zemo. He has broken through the wall and found Hydra's secret documents. But there's only one thing he's been desperately searching for: the red notebook with the star. Zemo demands information, but Karpov refuses. He would never betray Hydra. Zemo doesn't argue. He simply turns on the faucet and walks away. Back with the Avengers, the debate continues. Should they sign the Accords or not? Vision, an artificial intelligence with a synthetic body, explains to them that ever since the Avengers emerged, increasingly powerful enemies have also begun to appear. Alien invasions, large-scale attacks. That's why, perhaps, having oversight wouldn't be such a bad idea. Then, Tony shows them the photo of Charles Spencer, a young engineering graduate with a brilliant future ahead of him. Before starting his career, he decided to help, spending the summer building sustainable homes in Sokovia. They'll never know what he could have contributed to the world because a building was dropped on him. Tony declares we need to be held accountable, whatever form that takes. Tony's decision to support the Accords doesn't seem to stem from a true belief that it's best for the Avengers to operate under the UN, nor that it's the most effective way to help the world. Rather, it seems to be a way, as he himself puts it, to be held accountable. In other words, to accept a sanction, a punishment, for all of the harm they've caused, as if, by submitting to the UN's rules, they could atone for their guilt and redeem themselves, both in the eyes of others and in their own. This kind of approach closely resembles what was proposed by Desmond Tutu. a South African archbishop who played a key role after the end of apartheid. Apartheid was a system that existed in South Africa for nearly 50 years, in which white people held all privileges and black people were treated as second-class citizens. They couldn't live in the same neighborhoods or access the same services. Many suffered violence, forced poverty, humiliation, and even crimes such as torture and murder. When apartheid ended, the country was technically able to reunite, but the pain, anger, and desire for justice were so overwhelming that it seemed impossible. So, Tutu proposed something called restorative justice, which meant that the person who caused harm had to publicly admit what they had done, sincerely ask for forgiveness, and through that, they could recover their moral dignity and rejoin the community. For Tutu, this not only helped the victim heal, but also allowed the perpetrator to be freed from guilt and start anew. In this way, accepting the sanction and exposing oneself publicly was seen as a step toward redemption. However, philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who had done extensive work on justice, emotions, and human rights, criticizes this approach. She argues that publicly exposing the wrongdoer, forcing them to admit what they did and ask for forgiveness, can be a form of punishment disguised as justice, as it feeds the desire to see the other suffer to make them pay. And while that may provide some emotional relief to both the wrongdoer and the community, Nussbaum argues that it does not repair the actual harm, nor does it transform the conditions that made it possible in the first place. Nussbaum believed that justice should not focus on humiliation or emotional punishment, but rather on effective reparation and the construction of a more just future. From Nussbaum's perspective, Tony's act of being held accountable through the Accords would not be ethical, but an emotional reaction, a way of seeking punishment and personal redemption more than a real solution. What do you think? Is signing the Accords truly a decision made for the common good, or just a way for Tony to ease his guilt? Steve doesn't agree with Tony. He tells him, if someone dies on your watch, you don't give up. Tony replies that no one is giving up. But Steve counters, that's exactly what we've been doing, by refusing to take responsibility for our actions. This document only shifts the blame. Steve speaks from his military experience. He knows that on a mission, terrible things can happen. People get hurt or even die. But that doesn't mean you should stop or hand over your decisions to someone else. The duty remains and must be fulfilled, even if the cost is high. Unlike Tony, Steve doesn't see mistakes as something that should be avoided at all costs, but as an inevitable part of the risk that comes with the action. While Tony seeks a way not to carry the consequences, Steve believes the only dignified response is to bear them fully. To him, signing the Accords would be the easy way out, because it doesn't make them more responsible, it just allows them to shift the guilt onto someone else. Let the UN decide, and if something goes wrong, it's also the UN that bears the consequences. To Steve, the Accords don't repair the damage, don't prevent it from happening again, and don't propose a better way to act. They simply erase the conscience. And to stop doing what's right just to avoid feeling guilty, that, to him, is surrendering. Now, of course, Tony makes a very valid point. They've caused disasters, and it would be wise to find ways to avoid them, to limit the damage, anticipate risks, and have a clearer plan of action. But as Steve points out, the Accords do none of that. They don't offer real solutions. They just shift the responsibility elsewhere. And if we think about it, this also happens in the real world. Treaties are signed, committees are created, reforms are announced, but underneath it all, there's no clear plan of action. Just documents meant to calm the public, create a sense of order, and spread the blame when something fails, but not to stop it from failing. What do you think? Should they sign the Accords? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Rhodey, Tony's best friend, tells Steve he's being too arrogant. It's the United Nations. You can trust them. But Steve, who has lived much longer than Rhodey, knows that no institution should be trusted blindly. Not because they're inherently bad, but because they can always be influenced by political interest and may not act in the name of common good. Steve states, what if they send us somewhere we don't believe we should go? What if there's somewhere we need to go and they don't let us? We may not be perfect, but the safest hands are still our own. In case you don't remember, Steve was born in 1918. That means he was 25 years old when he fought in World War II, a time when the Nazis controlled Germany through laws, institutions, and fully official political structures. Millions of people, convinced they were obeying their government, ended up committing atrocities. Steve saw firsthand how following orders without question can lead to horrific consequences. And that wasn't the only time. Years later, he worked for an organization called SHIELD, which was supposed to protect the world. But he discovered it had been infiltrated by Hydra, a criminal group that manipulated decisions from within. Assassinations were carried out. all under the guise of a trusted institution. That's why, when he's asked to trust the United Nations just because it's a recognized body, he doesn't see it as a guarantee, but a risk. Because if that institution were to be manipulated one day, or simply make a mistake, they would no longer have the right to refuse. Steve learned the hard way that you can't let yourself be blindly led by what an institution, no matter how large or how respected, asks of you. It's just as important to develop your own judgment. It's very interesting to see how each one's personal history, Tony and Steve's, shapes their life philosophy, their way of understanding good and responsibility. It's not that one knows more than the other, but that their experiences have led them to believe in different things. Tony, after making serious mistakes, begins to believe that the wisest thing is to leave the hard decisions to someone else, because he no longer trusts his own judgment. Steve, on the other hand, saw what happens when people simply obey without questioning. And that's why he came to the opposite conclusion, that you have an obligation to think for yourself, to make your own decisions, even if you're wrong, because the worst thing you can do is give up and hand over your conscience to someone else. And I think that's the most significant difference between Tony and Steve. One fears his own judgment, the other fears losing it. Surprisingly, Natasha supports Tony. If they don't sign, they won't even be allowed to operate. Maybe it's better to adapt, even if it means doing so under new conditions. Steve receives a message. Peggy, the love of his youth, has passed away in her sleep. He's devastated. He goes to the funeral and carries the casket with a shattered heart. In front of everyone, Sharon Carter, Peggy's grandniece, gives a eulogy. She shares that her aunt always told her, "Where you feel you must not yield, do not. Even if everyone tells you that wrong is right, even if the whole world tells you to move, your duty is to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye, and say, 'No, you move.'" Steve listens and silently nods. Those words confirm everything for him. This speech is taken directly from the original comics. In one of its most famous versions, it says, "It doesn't matter what the press says. It doesn't matter what the politicians or the crowd say. It doesn't matter if the entire country decides that something wrong is right." This nation was founded on one principle above all else: the obligation to stand up for what we believe, no matter the odds or the consequences. And I believe this quote perfectly sums up how Captain America understands morality. For him, doing what's right is a duty that does not change with circumstances. The consequences don't matter. Institutions and public opinion don't matter. What is right remains right, even if no one does it. And what is wrong remains wrong, even if everyone practices it. That way of thinking reflects an ethical stance known as deontology, developed by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. According to this view, some principles must always be respected simply because they are just. For example, protecting the innocent, defending freedom, treating others with dignity, taking responsibility for your actions, and not staying silent in the face of injustice. Kant said that if an action is so just that we would want everyone to act that way, then we have the duty to do it. Not because it's convenient, not because someone commands it, but because it is the right thing to do. And that is exactly what Steve Rogers does. He firmly believes that there are things that must always be defended, plain and simple, because they are right. Natasha finds Steve and tells him that Tony, Vision, Rhodey, and she have decided to sign the Accords. They will attend the meeting in Vienna. The rest of the team disagrees and will not attend. Steve apologizes. He can't sign. Natasha already knew, but even so, she hugs him, and they part on peaceful terms. In Vienna, the UN meeting begins. Natasha greets King Chaka of Wakanda and his son, T'Challa. The king takes the podium. He speaks about how, sometimes, even with good intentions, our actions cause harm, but that does not exempt us from taking responsibility. Suddenly, T'Challa notices something strange. A press van pulls out a weapon. He shouts for everyone to get down. He leaps toward his father to shield him, but the bomb explodes before he can reach him. He runs to him, but it's too late. Chaka is dead. His son remains on the ground, devastated. The attack leaves 12 people dead and more than 70 injured. Hours later, the news reports publish the image of the main suspect, Bucky Barnes. Steve freezes. Everyone will be looking for him, and they will eliminate him. Natasha finds T'Challa and offers her condolences, but he doesn't want sympathy. He says he will personally make sure Bucky is eliminated. Later, Natasha calls Steve. She knows what Bucky means to him, but she asks him not to get involved. He can't save him. If he does, he'll become a fugitive, but Steve can't just stand by. Bucky isn't just his friend. He's someone who was manipulated, used. He wasn't in control of his actions. Steve can't let him be blamed for something he didn't choose to do. Even if it puts him at odds with the law, his teammates, or the entire world, Steve is going to defend him. Sam Wilson, aka Falcon, tells Steve he's going to support him. Sharon Carter, too. She hands him the latest intel on Bucky's whereabouts. She warns him to hurry. The police have orders to shoot on sight. Meanwhile, in a hotel, Zemo quickly recites the words from the red notebook. Benign, welcome, 1, freight car. There's a knock at the door. Room service. Zemo answers, but doesn't let him in. He has something dangerous hidden in the closet. In Bucharest, Bucky's at the market. He realizes he's being watched. He sees himself on the news and knows they're hunting him. He rushes back to his apartment, only to find Steve already waiting for him. Bucky assures him he wasn't the one who attacked the UN. Steve believes him, but there's no time. The agents are coming up the stairs. They break down the door. A fight breaks out. Steve protects him, and Bucky manages to escape the building. But in the street, someone intercepts him. Black Panther. Bucky runs. Panther follows, and Steve goes after them. They leap across the rooftops, dash through avenues. Eventually, the police surround them. There's no way out. Rhodey, Tony's best friend, shows up. He looks at Steve and says, "Congratulations, you're a criminal now." Black Panther removes his mask and reveals his identity. It's T'Challa. The police take all of them in. Meanwhile, at the Avengers compound, Vision doesn't let Wanda leave. He doesn't want any more incidents. Wanda is furious. At the government facility, Bucky is locked in a cell. Steve, Sam, and T'Challa are only under custody. Tony sits down with Steve. He confesses that he broke up with his girlfriend, Pepper Potts. Years ago, he almost lost her, and that's why he destroyed his Iron Man suits. But then came the Hydra situation, and Ultron, and he hasn't been able to stop. And the truth is, he doesn't want to, but he also doesn't want to lose Pepper. He thought that maybe, with the Accords, they could find some kind of middle ground. Here, we're given a deeper layer to Tony's motivation for signing the Accords. It's not just about sharing responsibility or easing his guilt. Deep down, Tony seems to be trying to resolve a conflict that he no longer knows how to handle within himself. On one hand, he wants to keep saving the world, but on the other hand, he can't ignore everything that's gone wrong, the damage he's caused, the lives lost, even the strain on his relationship with Pepper. He seems trapped between his desire to remain Iron Man and the urgent need to change something, to find a middle ground. And so, the Accords appear as a possible way out, a way to impose external limits on a life he no longer knows how to manage from within. Signing the Accords seems to solve everything. It helps ease his guilt. It gives him the sense that he can prevent more mistakes. It shows Pepper that he's willing to change. All of that without ceasing to be Iron Man. But the problem is that the Accords don't guarantee any of it. They don't undo the damage he's already caused. They don't propose concrete ways to improve the Avengers' work. They don't explain how to prevent more mistakes in the future. And they definitely don't ensure that Tony will get his relationship back. The only thing they really seem to do is leave decisions in the hands of a political committee. They decide when and where the Avengers should act, period. Now, it is true that some form of regulation is necessary. It's not acceptable for a group of superheroes to cross borders and act on their own without protocols or proper training to handle high-risk crises. Even they need rules. But the Accords, as they're currently framed, don't seem to be a real solution. What would make sense is to create a system that establishes clear protocols for different situations, allows for external audits to ensure accountability, defines clear consequences for negligent actions, and perhaps most importantly, ensures that decisions are based on ethical principles, not political interests or agendas. That, in my view, would be a useful way to improve how the Avengers operate. But the Accords don't aim in that direction. They don't propose concrete or real improvements, only demanding obedience. In the end, like many things in politics, they seem more like a response meant to soothe the public opinion than a true, deep solution. So, do they actually resolve what Tony wants to fix? The truth is, no. It seems Tony doesn't sign them for what they actually do, but for what he wants them to mean: redemption, balance, and reconciliation. But none of that is truly in the document. It's just an illusion. Steve tells him he didn't know about the breakup, that he's not trying to cause trouble. He's just doing what he believes is right. Tony replies that he understands. That's why his father, Howard Stark, always admired him. In case you don't remember, Howard was the one who created the first super soldier serum that turned Steve into Captain America. And he also designed the iconic shield. Tony suggests that maybe they can make some adjustments to the Accords, that there might be a way to reach a middle ground. And for a moment, Steve considers it. After all, he doesn't want the Avengers to split either. He's about to give in, but then he asks, "Where's Wanda?" Tony tells him she's at the compound. She's being held there, so he refuses to sign. Every time he thinks Tony's doing the right thing, he finds out he's hiding something. Tony says he's just doing the best he can with what he has, but Steve doesn't believe him. The UN sends a psychologist to evaluate Bucky. He begins with routine questions. Everything seems normal. Meanwhile, Steve reviews the photo of Bucky at the bombing. Why did the police release that image? On the outskirts of the city, a man at a power plant receives a package. The psychologist receives confirmation the package has been delivered. And then the truth is revealed. He's not a psychologist. He's Zemo. The package contains an electromagnetic bomb. The explosion knocks out power across the city. The cameras and systems monitoring Bucky shut down. Zemo is left alone with him. He opens Hydra's red notebook. He repeats the activation words. Bucky drops into Winter Soldier mode. Steve and Sam manage to survive, but it's too late. The Winter Soldier attacks with full force. Zemo uses the chaos to escape. Steve tries to stop Bucky. They end up falling into the water, and Bucky is left unconscious. Zemo listens to a voicemail. It's his wife. She asked again if you were coming. I told her I wasn't sure. You should have seen her little face. Try to make it, okay? I'm going to sleep now. Love you. Zemo closes his eyes. He's devastated. He boards a flight bound for Moscow. When Bucky wakes up, he tells Steve that Zemo is headed to an old Hydra base in Siberia. He reveals that it was there they created 5 other Winter Soldiers, using the serum he stole in 1991. Steve believes Zemo plans to wake them and unleash them on the world. He can't let that happen. They need to stop him. But with the Avengers divided, he needs reinforcements. He calls Clint Barton, aka Hawkeye, Wanda, and Scott Lang, Ant-Man. Meanwhile, Tony tries to convince the government to give him time to resolve the matter without further damage. He manages to get Ross to grant him 36 hours to reason with the other Avengers and get them to surrender willingly. He gathers his team, Natasha, Chala, Rhodey, and Vision, but it's still not enough. So he goes to New York and recruits Peter Parker, Spider-Man. Steve's team prepares to travel to Siberia, but the sirens sound. The airport is being evacuated. Tony has arrived. Steve moves ahead. He tries to reach the helicopter, but Tony, now in his Iron Man suit, intercepts him. Steve tries to explain. The psychologist who evaluated Bucky was an imposter. This was all orchestrated. Zemo wants to activate 5 super soldiers, and they're the only ones who can stop him, but Tony won't listen anymore. He tells him to surrender, to stop tearing the Avengers apart. Steve replies, "You already did that when you signed." Amid the chaos, Steve and Bucky manage to board the jet. Tony and Rhodey try to stop them. Vision fires a beam to bring them down and hits Rhodey instead. He plummets and crashes. He survives, but is left paralyzed. The rest of Steve's team is arrested by the government. Meanwhile, at Zemo's hotel, room service enters with breakfast. Getting no response, they open the door and find the body of the real UN psychologist. On the jet, headed to Siberia, Bucky tells Steve it's not worth it. Steve looks at him and replies that everything he did was because of Hydra, because of what they did to his mind. But Bucky looks back and says, "Yeah, but it was still me who did it." Meanwhile, Tony receives news that the body of the real UN psychologist has been found. He was intercepted by Helmet Zero, a former member of the Sokovian Death Squad. Additionally, police found a wig and facial prosthetics designed to imitate Bucky Barnes. Tony realizes that Steve wasn't lying. In Siberia, Zemo arrives at Hydra's secret base and finds the 5 super soldiers. Meanwhile, Tony visits the prison where the Avengers who helped Steve are being held. He speaks with the Secretary of State. He tells him everything he discovered, that Bucky was manipulated, that the real culprit is Zemo. He hopes that this changes things, that they'll stop chasing Steve and focus on capturing the true responsible party. But Ross cuts him off coldly. "Do you really think I'm going to listen to you after all the disasters you've caused? You're lucky you're not in one of these cells too." And with that, it becomes clear. They're not going to stop pursuing Steve. They don't care about the truth. Ross isn't after justice. He just wants to keep the Avengers under control. Tony is stunned. He thought they were on the same team, but now he understands that Ross never saw him as an ally. He sees him as part of the problem. With this, Tony starts to see what Steve had been trying to say all along, that even though it might seem comfortable, even reassuring, to let others make decisions for you, that too can be dangerous. Because an institution or authority won't always have justice in mind. They won't always do what's right. Tony signed the Accords, believing that the world would be safer that way. But now he's realizing that if those in charge won't listen, won't correct mistakes, and won't pursue justice, then it actually leaves everyone far more vulnerable. He understands that the hardest thing, and perhaps also the most courageous, is to form your own judgment and take responsibility for what comes next. Tony looks at Wanda, weak, trapped in a cell, as if she were a threat. Guilt gnaws at him. He looks at Hawkeye and apologizes. He says he didn't know they were going to lock them up like that. But Clint answers that, of course he did. Maybe not the details, but he knew they were going to be locked up somewhere. He tells him they're being treated like criminals, when not long ago, they were heroes. Tony tries to justify himself. He says they broke the law, that they chose the wrong side, but even he doesn't believe what he's saying. Then he speaks with Sam. He admits he was wrong. Now he needs to help Steve. Sam gives him the location. They're in Siberia. Tony leaves immediately. Black Panther follows him. Meanwhile, Steve and Bucky have already arrived. They enter the base. Tony appears. He says, Maybe your story wasn't so crazy after all. But he asks them not to tell Ross he's there, because technically, he'd have to arrest himself. They reach the area where the super soldiers are, but find them lifeless, executed. It wasn't what they expected. Then Zemo's voice is heard. Did you really think I wanted more like you? He then tells them he never intended to wake them. He just needed to draw them there, all three of them, to finish what he started. Steve, confused, asks if he really killed all those people at the UN just to bring them there. Zemo nods. I didn't think about anything else for a whole year. I studied you. I followed you, every single move. Steve insists, is this about Sokovia? Did you lose someone? Zemo looks him in the eye and declares, I lost them all, and you will too. He reveals that his plan was always to divide the Avengers. He doesn't want to destroy them by force. He wants them to break from within, because an empire attacked from outside can rebuild. But if it falls from within, there's no fixing it. Zemo shows them a video. Tony recognizes it immediately. It's the night his parents died. In the footage, the crash is shown. And then, Bucky, the one responsible for their deaths. But he didn't just cause the crash. When Howard Stark tries to get out of the car, the Winter Soldier beats him to death. Then he goes to his mother, grabs her by the neck, and strangles her. Tony lunges at Bucky, but Steve holds him back. Tony looks at him and asks if he knew. Steve hesitates for a moment and says, I didn't know it was him. Tony doesn't believe him. Steve lowers his eyes and says, yes. Tony knocks him down. Bucky reacts to defend him, and the fight erupts. Zemo simply walks away, satisfied. He doesn't have to do anything else. They'll destroy themselves. Tony grabs Bucky by the throat and asks if he even remembers them. I remember them all. Steve tries to calm Tony. He tells him it wasn't Bucky's fault, that Hydra was controlling him, that none of it was his choice. But Tony replies, I don't care. He killed my mom. Meanwhile, Zemo listens one last time to the voicemail his wife left him. You should have seen her little face. Try to make it, okay? I'm going to sleep. Love you. He's completely shattered. T'Challa appears behind him, but Zemo doesn't care. He tells him that during the Battle of Sokovia, he lost his father, his wife, and his son. It took him 2 days to find their bodies. Meanwhile, the Avengers just went home. He knew he couldn't kill the superheroes. Stronger men had already tried, but he could make them destroy each other. He apologizes to T'Challa for his father. He says he seemed like a good man, with a responsible son. T'Challa sees what vengeance has done to Zemo, and he decides he's not going to let it consume him either. He tells him that justice will come, but in due time. Zemo tries to take his own life, but T'Challa stops him. The living are not done with you yet. Tony and Steve keep fighting. Tony manages to knock Steve down. Then Steve counterattacks. He uses the shield to strike the suit's arc reactor and disable Tony. He walks over to Bucky, helps him up, and prepares to leave. But Tony yells, that shield doesn't belong to you. You don't deserve it. My father made that shield. He looks at the shield he's carried his whole life and lets it go. What does this iconic scene mean? Some believe that Steve drops the shield because he no longer feels worthy of carrying it, as if by defending Bucky, he had put his friendship above what is right, above his principles, and in the end, realized he no longer deserved to be Captain America. But I see it differently. To me, Steve doesn't regret defending Bucky. He still believes Bucky shouldn't have to pay for crimes he committed while his mind was not his own. I believe he didn't do it just because of their bond or out of blind loyalty, but because he genuinely believed it was the right thing to do. And knowing him, he probably would have done the same for anyone, even for Tony. However, what he does acknowledge is that in making that decision, he ended up deeply hurting someone he also cares about. He knew how important the truth was to Tony, and still he kept it from him. And even though he did it with the intention of protecting Bucky, and perhaps to spare Tony more pain, he caused harm. It's a theme that repeats throughout the film. Even when we act with the best intentions, we can still be wrong. We can still hurt others. So, it seems to me that Steve drops the shield, not because he no longer feels worthy of being Captain America, but because he recognizes what that shield means to his friend. And as a gesture of respect toward him and toward his father, he chooses to leave it behind, so as not to keep hurting him. What do you think? Does this interpretation make sense to you, or do you see it differently? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Zemo is captured and imprisoned. A government official mocks him, telling him that his entire plan was a failure. But Zemo isn't so sure. The Avengers are broken, perhaps irreparably. Tony continues as best he can. He builds a device to help Rhodey try to walk again. Rhodey tells him that, despite everything, he doesn't regret signing. Tony receives a letter from Steve, who apologizes for not telling him the truth about his parents. He explains that he thought he was being compassionate, but in reality, he was just protecting himself. He asks for forgiveness. He tells him he wishes they could have agreed on the Accords, but he knows each of them did what they believed was right. And that's all that really matters. He promises that no matter what happens, if Tony ever needs him, he'll be there for him. Meanwhile, Steve breaks into the secret prison and frees the Avengers. After everything we've discussed, It seems the core of this entire film is the idea that doing good isn't always as clear as it seems. Sometimes standing up for what's right puts you at odds with the rules, with public opinion, even with your own friends. And at other times, even with the best intentions, you can make mistakes and cause harm. But I believe that doesn't mean we should give up. Nor should we completely surrender our decisions to someone else's hands. Beyond the Sokovia Accords, beyond signing or not signing, I believe the real question this film leaves us with is, what should we do when, in trying to do good, things don't go as we hoped? Should we give up? Should we let others decide for us, just to avoid taking responsibility? Or perhaps, what we should do is take ownership of the difficulties and mistakes, and keep fighting for justice, for the most vulnerable, and for our principles. While some believe the film doesn't offer a clear answer about who was right, Iron Man or Captain America, I believe it does. It just leaves the answer between the lines. What do you think? What do you believe was right? Or could it be that both were right in some ways? I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks for staying until the end of the video. Don't forget to subscribe and share it with a friend who you think might enjoy it. And you and I'll see you in the next one.